This is the audio recording of a POW story about Sgt Don MacPhail. Don Allen McPhail was born on March 3, 1948 in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. He enlisted in the U.S. Army on April 2, 1968 and completed basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey in the same year. After advanced individual training, airborne school, and special forces training, he's sent to Vietnam in early 1969. While in Vietnam, he's assigned to K Company, 75th Army Infantry, later to be known as the Highland Rangers. He was a radio man for a special forces team while in Vietnam. The team was parachuted in near Cambodia with two other U.S. personnel and a Montagnard. His team consisted of Sergeant Kenneth Hess, Sergeant Don MacPhail, PFC Nathaniel Irvin, aka Dobby Jones, and a Montagnard scout named Ju Mok. Their mission was to look for North Vietnamese Army escape routes coming down from Vietnam through Cambodia. McPhail was the team leader at the time, and everything was going normal until February 4th, when they heard movement. McPhail had radio contact, and then he said that he glanced about 15 to 20 men, as he was moving fast to get out of the area. Shortly after that, the heavy caliber machine guns opened up, followed by AKs. Jones was making for cover when he was hit and killed. McPhail realized they were in an ambush site and surrounded on all sides. The men started to head for the trees. He said that Jones was dead, and he'd seen him crumpled up and most of his head was gone. The fighting lasted for about 25 minutes. At one point, Don picked up the radio to make contact, and as he started to speak, the radio was shot out of his hands. Don told the yard to use the 60 gun and work the area near the rear, while Hess and Don used frags and phosphorus grenades, which appeared to work at suppressing the Viet Cong. They began to fall back, but they were actually trying a flanking maneuver. The only thing in the situation that was the saving grace of these men was cover. They had good cover and a good view. The men were putting up a good fight, and the team was taking out approaching VC. This led the VC to set fire to the elephant grass and their most likely escape routes. Sergeant Hess was taken at close range by a VC, and he was in hand-to-hand combat with the man when Don shot from the hip and dropped him. The guy was less than 2 feet away from Don while engaged with Hess. At some point after this encounter, Hess was shot in the head. A chunk of it was now missing. And then Don got hit in the leg. He was flipped and spun. The Montagnard, seeing all of this, assumed both men were dead and began to run. Don too made a run, for although the enemy was burning grass, he headed straight for it, through the burning grass and straight into a ravine, killing several VC in the process. It was less of a run and more of a charge. For the next few days, 4 to be total, Don was making his way using escape and evasion tactics with sporadic gunfights. He had lost some blood from the bullet wounds, and he was exhausted, and he took a moment to look through his map to get his bearings to find the nearest enemy friendly camp. It was a special forces camp that was about 5 miles away, so he headed that way. He was taking an established trail, which is a no-no for most special forces gentlemen, but it was the easiest route, and since he was wounded and fatigued, he didn't feel much like wading through the jungle thickets. Exhaustion got the better of him. He managed to evade for another 45 minutes after being discovered, but eventually they caught up to him. He ended up taking 2 more rounds in his legs, and about 15 fragments from fragment grenades that were being thrown at him, one of which bounced off of his head, landed 3 feet away from him, and when it blew up, he was rendered unconscious. The next thing he recalls are hands grabbing at him and being bound in rope. Later on, a bright light team was sent to search for the missing team, and while on the ground, searching the area of the battle, the Montagnard, seeing American friendlies, came out to greet them, but they mistook him for a Viet Cong and ended up killing him in the confusion. Don was now a POW, and so that life began. On February 8th, 1969, began his first days as a POW. He would spend the next 14 months in different camps in isolation. He would spend the next 14 months in camp in isolation. There were several other soldiers in the camp. All were special forces. All of the men he believes died shortly after. 4 of them were killed in front of him, and the other 3 died of sickness. En route to a different camp, he managed an escape attempt, but was quickly recaptured. While in all of the camps that he was in, he never received any medical attention. He was never offered anything except for a bandage on his initial capture, and that was just over his right leg. During this period, he still had 3 bullet wounds, and the interrogators would often stick a metal rod through these leg holes. Since Don was still wearing his tiger stripe camo, which was an indicator of being Special Forces, the VC knew he was such, and the treatment against him, the harshness, and the beatings were increased. He understood a little Vietnamese, enough to gather that the men who he was now with were part of the group that he'd made contact with before, and he'd killed several of their friends. And they wanted to shoot him right there on the spot. Then an NVA man in a uniform came up and ordered the men to not execute him, but in fact to deliver him alive for further interrogations. The interrogators wanted to know basic military stuff related to the size of his outfits, the weapons they were used, and what the mission was, and so forth. Don had no identifying papers on him, and his fatigues were sterile at the time of his capture. He ended up taking on the name of a dead buddy, assuming that he would be treated as a mercenary and not a soldier. But this ended up being a hindrance since the military had marked him as MIA, and his wife believed he was dead. A typical day for Don was not very fun, to say the least. Since he did manage an escape attempt, he was held in stocks for over 22 hours a day, with opportunities to defecate and urinate only allotted from 0430 to 1500 hours. His feet were tied to a log, and whenever he had the opportunity, he would urinate into a bamboo tube. If he was good during interrogations, he would be allotted 2 hand-rolled cigarettes, and then it was back to the stocks, and then again at 1500 for defecation opportunities and the opportunity to enjoy some Radio Hanoi propaganda. Propaganda was a really fun part of Don's day. They didn't have the big-time resources for a brainwashing campaign, and the indoctrination was pretty minimal. But since he did arrive in North Vietnam, he was taught about the 4,000-year history of the country, and to their amazement, Don was very interested. He actually really enjoyed learning about Vietnamese history. Mostly this was a slow build-up to the indoctrination of communism. In North Vietnam, it was mainly just blaring Radio Hanoi and sitting through lectures on communism. When Don got there, he weighed a total of 196 pounds, there being Cambodia. And then whenever he got to North Vietnam, he was 115 pounds. He had gathered a morbid sense of humor, along with his other prisoners. One day, Don was using the latrine, which was just a 9-foot hole filled with excrement that had a single board laying over top of it. The hole had been in use for over 2 years, and the board was old and rotting. When Don went to go use it, the board gave out. Don fell in and was up to his neck and waist. None of the guys could get out of their hooches to help him. From McPhail himself, quote, "What came over and helped me was a pig, a hog. He came over, looked at me, and went to the bathroom on my head. He didn't know what in the hell was going on, and he tried to lick me. He fell in the hole with me and drowned, or rather, suffocated. Finally, after standing on the back of the pig, I was pulled out and placed in solitary confinement with no food and water for 4 days because I killed one of their pigs in the hole. At the time, I didn't think it was funny, but it was really hilarious to the other guys. Everybody got a real big kick out of it, and I did. Afterwards, I thought it was pretty funny. I could just see this pig, this big 400-pound hog coming at me, and I couldn't do anything about it." End quote. You just gotta keep yourself entertained in these environments, apparently, and laughing at the death of a pig in excrement is how you would do so. While en route to their next camp in North Vietnam, Don was beaten by his guards and by the people of the towns they would pass through. He could hear bombing runs and see muzzle flashes off in the distance, which he later found out was an assault by special forces to try and locate POWs and return them. This was possibly Operation Ivory Coast. One man who could not keep going had his throat slit and was left there to die. Don was still pretty strong at this point, and his legs could bear a load, so he ended up carrying the supplies of 3 other men who couldn't. He was still in his tiger stripe camos, and the NVA men making their way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail would see this, recognize it as special forces, and start to beat Don, and the guards would do nothing to stop it. The last stop before their destination in North Vietnam was a stronghold that the NVA held. Don was using isometrics to try and strengthen his legs, and since he was suffering from pneumonia and dysentery, it had weakened him further, but he figured he'd try make an escape attempt, but they moved out before he could. The new destination was the zoo. It was southwest of Hanoi, and here he was assigned to a 6-foot-long, maybe 5-foot-wide room, painted all black, with temperatures during the day that would reach excesses of 130 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Meals were given twice a day, and you were forced to sit at attention at your bed, waiting to go to the dead man's hooch, which is an interrogation room. Screams would come from this room at all hours of the night, and if you were lucky, you would be brought back from the hooch after giving the information that they wanted. You'd be fed, allowed half an hour of sleep, and then more interrogations and beatings. Don was put into a room, and a man who came back from that room was in terrible condition. McPhail recounts, quote, "The man they put in the cell with me later had half of his head blown off and was suffering convulsions, and they wouldn't do anything for him. I could only try to help him with my Special Forces first aid training. He made it back several weeks ago. They performed an operation on his head while he will be partially paralyzed for the rest of his life. At least he can walk." End quote. This is from an interview he did with a newspaper. The man did eventually end up coming back to the States and lived, but he was partially paralyzed. Don had his own trials and tribulations while he was there. He suffered some pretty horrendous torture. This next account is often misassociated with Jim Thompson, who is America's longest-serving POW. But it's actually McPhail who is the one who suffered this terror. This is from a C-SPAN interview with Tom Philpott, the author of Glory Denied. Quote, "At one point, the Viet Cong had pulled out all of his toenails and fingernails. The psychiatrist interviewed him, tried to get him to talk about his experience. And he found that psychiatrist crying at the clubbing experience for his fingernails and toenails it had gone through." End quote. The VC interrogators had indeed pulled out Don's fingernails and toenails and began clubbing at the raw, exposed flesh. On how he can talk so casually about such things, he responded so, quote, "I've put a shield around myself. I feel perhaps just like a doctor. You see so many sick and dying people, and you know a certain number of them are going to die, and you just can't sit there and cry about it for the rest of your life. It's just not going to do any good. It's not going to bring back anybody. I'll never forget the things that happened, but I'm not going to ruin the rest of my life because of that. I expected it anyway. I expected a lot more than did happen. I didn't expect to get back." End quote. He had been beaten with the butts of rifles so many times that for about 6 to 9 months he had blood in his urine. As of the 1973 interview, he was still due back for an operation to help with this. They would often play sick games, the NVA guards would. They would take a rat, which were plentiful in the area, and pour gasoline on it and set it on fire. They also did this with dogs and cats. Once Don got fed up and hit a guard for which he was beaten by at first 3 men, then 5, then about a whole platoon of men were just hitting him in turns. It would not let up. He saw men ignoring orders from officers to halt the beating, and they just kept on beating him. He suffered effects from his beatings for a long time after the war. Camp Hollywood. Camp Hollywood was the one that Jane Fonda visited, one of the ones, nicknamed by the men. Don MacPhail recounts a tragic story from the encounter that one man had during the visit before Jane Fonda showed up. This is from McPhail. Quote, "This man, a Navy pilot, was told that He had to write a letter to his wife saying he was very sick with malaria and that if he did not go into the Jane Fonda program, he would be executed, and this letter would be sent back to the U.S. authorities, and his wife would find out he had died from malaria rather than having been executed. So, like I say, you don't have a choice. After a while, you're going to do it, what they want. Continuing, the man wrote the letter and was told to go shave and get ready for the program. So he shaved all the hair off of his head, and of course the cheese got very mad about the whole thing. So he was ordered to wear a hat. They put him back in his room to await the program. When they went to get him, he had taken a chair, broken it up, gouged his whole face out. End quote. He ended up losing an eye and requiring multiple surgeries once stateside, but he did live. End of war and homecoming. After spending 1,498 days in captivity, 1,498 days, Sergeant McPhail was released during Operation Homecoming on March 16, 1973, along with Jim Thompson. There's a picture of the two together when they returned in uniform. It's a pretty good photo. One of the few times you'll see Thompson look happy, and then, of course, McPhail looks actually pretty good in this photo. He was briefly hospitalized to recover from the injuries at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where he needed surgeries for plastic inserts for his nose, cheeks, ribs, and jaw. He also had the whole loss of fingernails and toenail trauma and the trauma that comes along with that. That's probably something that stays with you. I mean, most people don't live long enough to suffer from an experience like that, but McPhail did. He did suffer long-term effects from his terror. He had lingering hopelessness and other illnesses that he got in the jungle that stuck with them until the day he died. He left active duty and joined the Army Reserves on December 14, 1973, and then returned to active duty on January 14, 1975. He received an honorable discharge from the Army on December 15, 1977, and left at the rank of Staff Sergeant. He was a resident of Montague, Massachusetts for over 25 years. He'd studied criminal justice and was a patrolman for the Montague Police Department. He also went on to be Dean of Students at Turner Falls High School. And then later in his life, he decided to become an engineer for Amtrak until 2010. He was a POW for over 4 years in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And on September 23, 2011, at only the age of 63, he died from cancer. He was buried at Pine Ridge Cemetery in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. He left behind a wife, Frances, a son, Ian, 3 daughters from a previous marriage, Lisa Marie, Laura, and Dawn. In conclusion, Don MacPhail lived actually a pretty good life when he got back from the States. Often with gentlemen who are POWs, they do go on to do great things, but some can never truly get over what happened to them. There is something to be said about spending 9 years in captivity like Thompson did, and what happened to him was truly tragic. Everything from the moment he got captured until the moment he died was a tragedy. But I feel like with Don MacPhail, he actually went on to live a pretty good life when he got back. I mean, could you imagine getting pulled over by Don MacPhail, POW, who had his fingernails and toenails pulled out, and then you try and explain to him how you're having a bad day? He's probably not going to feel very sympathetic. But nevertheless, he went on to be policeman, a dean of students, and then go on to do something that he actually really wanted to do, which is be an engineer for Amtrak. But he did die at the age of 63, which is pretty young. And that we'll never get to talk to him or interview him any further. The few interviews that he did do were very early on when he got back from Vietnam. And I really would have liked to have heard what he had to say later on in his life. 2011, I had just been discharged from the military. several years and was kind of navel gazing at my own life. But I would really like to have heard more interviews from some of these POWs. And that's why I kind of like bringing light to their stories.